Hey there. Tonight we're exploring the history of the American front porch. The truth is, it wasn't just for lemonade. It rose with heat waves and epidemics, spread in Sears kit homes, and was shaped by who was welcome to linger. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. Presidents won elections without leaving the house. That sentence sounds like modern internet law, but it already happened on wooden steps and turned balusters more than a century ago. William McKinley stood on the front porch of his Canton, Ohio home in 1896 and delivered hundreds of speeches to crowds that added up to roughly 750,000 visitors. Warren G. Harding did a version of the same thing in 1920 in Marion, Ohio, greeting an estimated 600,000 people. The front porch wasn't just decoration. It functioned as a political stage, a neighborhood theater, a public health device, and a pressure valve for American life. Then, in a few decades, it nearly disappeared, swallowed by garages, curtains, and the hum of air conditioners. The comeback is underway, but this stage had a wild journey to get here. The American front porch did not descend from Plymouth Rock, appointment ready, with a swing and a flag bracket. Early British colonists in New England tended to build small entry stoops on their salt box and Georgian houses, not sprawling verandas. 18th century Anglo-American architecture was allergic to unnecessary outside rooms. Elbows were tucked in, lines were symmetrical, and the social action happened inside the parlor. The big classical porticos with Greek columns people picture on plantations arrived much later, in the Greek revival wave of the 1820s, 1850s. The real DNA of the porch reads like a global ancestry test. Ancient Greeks had the stoa, a long covered walkway that blurred the line between building and street. Romans built porticos. Islamic and Mediterranean houses revolved around shaded courtyards and loggias. In the Indian subcontinent, there was the veranda, a covered outdoor platform. The word itself, veranda or veranda, sailed into European languages through Portuguese, veranda, meaning railing or balcony. This baggage landed in the Caribbean and the American South, where steamy climates made shade a survival tool rather than a luxury. Meanwhile, in Dutch-settled New York, there was the stoop, a raised landing in front of townhouses that served as a stoop and social step. In New Orleans and along the Gulf Coast, French and Spanish colonial builders created galleries, wide balconies and porches that provided room to breathe. In the Southwest, Spanish colonial portals framed the thresholds of adobe buildings. By the time the United States realized it needed shade as much as symmetry, all these traditions were waiting with receipts. A correction handles the favorite myth. Colonists universally adored verandas. They did not. Early New England farmhouses mostly lacked them. Cold weather and Puritan restraint discouraged lounging in public. The South told a different story. Heat wrote the building code. Enslaved Africans, free black artisans, indigenous builders, and European-trained carpenters all contributed know-how on airflow, elevation, and shade, which turned into broad porches, double galleries, and deep eaves. Charleston's famous single houses, many built from the late 18th century into the mid-19th century, hinged on 2- and 3-story side porches called piazzas, angled to catch prevailing breezes off the Ashley and Cooper rivers. A street-facing door often leads not to a foyer but to the piazza, a kind of architectural side-eye for privacy. Savannah's and New Orleans's porch traditions do similar work in different dialects. Cast iron lacework, tall shutters, and proportions designed for shade and cross-ventilation. Porches began multiplying when American technology and taste entertained the same fantasy at the same moment. By the 1830s, 1840s, a carpenter could order machine-made nails by the bucket and lay up balloon framing with quickness. That framing system, popularized in places like Chicago in the 1830s, used standardized lumber, Hello 2x4, and sped construction. Railroads brought milled lumber and trim to towns that previously whittled everything by hand. Sawmills cranked out turned posts, spandrels and balusters like butter cookies. The scroll saw, a little marvel of the mid-19th century, enabled the gingerbread that later wrapped Victorian porches with frilly bravado. The factory was happy to oblige the veranda. Taste followed fast. Andrew Jackson Downing, the tastemaker of American domestic architecture, called the veranda. He preferred the fad, a moral and healthful space. In books like Cottage Residences, 1842, and The Architecture of Country Houses, 1850, he insisted that shaded outdoor rooms improved manners, health, and neighborliness. Calvert Vokes, Downing's collaborator and later the co-designer of Central Park, continued the sermon in villas and cottages. 1857, magazines lavishly illustrated porches. The message flowed like lemonade. Shade was civilized. Public health added pressure. 19th century Americans suffered through cholera outbreaks, yellow fever in the South, typhoid, and above all, tuberculosis. In 1900, tuberculosis killed around 194 people per 100,000 in the United States, a leading cause of death. The open-air movement spread a conviction that fresh air cured ills. Sleeping porches sprouted on second stories of houses from Maine to California. Doctors prescribed them. Sanatoria wrapped their wards with porches and platforms. Schools in northern cities ran winter. Open-air classroom experiments. There are photographs of Boston students in fur-lined sleeping bags at desks near open windows in 1908. Mosquitoes, the tiny public enemies behind malaria and yellow fever, motivated another useful invention: wire window screen. Connecticut manufacturer Gilbert and Bennett repurposed wire mesh used for sieves into insect screening around the 1860s. By the 1880s, screens were mass-produced and common. Screens transformed porches into survivable summer rooms in buggy climates. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention later credited combinations of drainage, DTDT, and window screening with the eradication of malaria in the continental US. By 1951, people did not need data to understand the immediate payoff of a screened porch. Fewer bites, better nights. Cities nurtured a parallel outdoor habit. The stoop, from the Dutch stoop, became a hallmark of 19th century New York and Philadelphia row houses. A brownstone stoop lifted the ground floor parlor above street muck before municipal sanitation caught up. It also established an auditorium of steps where neighbors could lean, watch, and comment with unfiltered precision. Street games like stoop ball treated those steps like a built-in backboard. In a country that loves to pretend private property is a sealed capsule, the stoop and porch carved out a public threshold where life spilled out and the block policed itself. Jane Jacobs, in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, 1961, canonized this as eyes on the street, a phrase about sidewalks but modeled equally by stoops and porches. By the 1870s, 1890s, porches climaxed in the gushy stage of Queen Anne and Eastlake-style houses, turrets included, with wraparound verandas described in plan books as broad and commodious, turned posts, spindlework friezes, scroll-cut brackets, and circular corner profiles exploded onto blocks like confetti. Streetcar suburbs for the rising middle class. Think 1880s to 1910s, made the porch a social device for commuting families. The daily commute by streetcar returned clerks and shopkeepers to leafy neighborhoods in time to sit outside, drifting between public and private without ever opening a fence gate. The house greeted the sidewalk with a stage. There are photographs from the 1890s of entire families posed like cast photos on their front porches. The camera is essentially across the footpath. The South orbited on its own axis with equal intensity. New Orleans perfected the double gallery, where 2 stories of porches allowed entire households to live outside as soon as the thermometer suggested it. Iron front buildings, like the Pontalba buildings on Jackson Square, constructed in 1849–50, cemented the gallery as civic culture. Along the Mississippi and its tributaries stood Greek Revival mansions, with monumental porticos. Oak Alley, 1836–39, is a postcard example, more colonnaded facade than porch, but revealing the appetite for shade and ceremony. Smaller farmhouses across Appalachia, and the Piedmont sprouted full-width porches roofed in tin. Dog trot houses in the deeper South used a central breezeway like a super porch to ventilate 2 cabins under one roof. Shotgun houses in New Orleans and small towns put a tight rectangle of porch at the street, a moment of shade bridging home and world. In black and white communities alike, porches served as informal story circles, workbenches, and babysitting stations. Gullah Geechee, women along the Carolina and Georgia coasts, wove sweetgrass baskets in the draft. Musicians practiced on porches. The acoustic guitar and the banjo sound different outside, and people knew it without spreadsheets. American politics spotted the usefulness. James A. Garfield, the 1880 Republican candidate, made front porch speeches from his home in Mentor, Ohio. Benjamin Harrison did it in 1888. McKinley turned the format into a high-efficiency event in 1896, and again in 1996, and again in 1900, with visiting delegations arriving by rail to Canton, led by banners and brass bands. Print counted the audiences and syndicated the words. Harding's 1920 front porch campaign added the era's hip new platform. Film newsreels recorded him greeting suffragists, veterans, and farmers on the same steps. The front porch turned out to be perfect for retail politics because it staged intimacy while broadcasting poise. The candidate stood as a homeowner, in good standing, with neighbors as witnesses, and signaled stability without abandoning reach. Political scientists later gave it words. Regular people already recognized the vibe. The bungalow hit like a best-selling album around 1905, 1930. California versions by Green and Green stuffed the idea with craftsmanship, and Zen, Midwest and Southern versions scaled it for mortgages and starter families. The American bungalow revered the porch, often framing a deep front veranda with massive battered piers and low, sheltering roof lines. Gustav Stickley, whose magazine, The Craftsman, ran from 1901 to 1916, promoted the porch as an outdoor living room, the stage for a lifestyle that prized simplicity over glitz. The bungalow democratized that idea through catalogs and kits. Sears, Roebuck & Co. sold ready-to-assemble houses between 1908 and 1942. Numbers vary by historian, but a common range estimates 70,000 to 70,000 to 75,000 kits shipped. Many included generous porches. Aladdin Homes out of Bay City, Michigan, sold comparable numbers. Pattern books and mail order plans multiplied like seed packs, and the front porch was not a luxury add-on. It was part of the kit. The porch handled more than leisure. It policed the street, especially in mill towns and rural crossroads, where a row of watchers on rocking chairs counted as security cameras with better gossip. It extended the domestic economy, snapping beans, shelling peas, mending clothes, undercover and within earshot of neighbors. It hosted rituals of courtship, with chaperones placed at a not-so-accidental distance. It created a semi-public audience for children, whose games spilled from yard to sidewalk, where the rules belonged to the block. Porch etiquette was serious business. It marked who belonged on the street and who did not. It offered hospitality to neighbors one step at a time, often literally one step up. It encoded race and class. Under Jim Crow, black families navigated this threshold with practiced caution, balancing neighborhood life with safety in companies' towns and rural communities where the porch delivered communities and visibility without full exposure. The promise of friendliness sat next to the reality of surveillance. Then the 20th century turned. Radio arrived in the 1920s. The automobile roared onto suburban streets, and houses turned around to face the backyard like a shy debutante. The decline of the American front porch did not happen because of a single villain. The list of suspects reads like a family reunion photo in an unflattering frame. Automobiles encouraged garages facing forward. The Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s and post-war lending standards rewarded streamlined, affordable designs with minimal ornament. Minimal traditional houses of the 1930s, 1950s shaved details down to the bone. Open-air porches often became enclosed sunrooms during the mid-century wave. Screens gave way to glass, shifting life behind panes. Builders, eager to deliver volume, replaced long labor millwork with cheaper, boxy stoops. Air conditioning completed the rotation. The first modern room air conditioner hit the market in 1931, but sales exploded after World War II. In 1954, annual room air conditioner sales in the US crested 1 million units, a benchmark that rewired summers. By 1960, roughly 12% of US state households had some form of air conditioning. By 1990, that figure climbed over 60%, and by the 2010s, well over 80%. In the South, central air penetration leapt fastest. Street voices lost out to the whisper of Freon. Television did not help. In 1950, about 9% of American households had TV sets. By 1960, roughly 87% did, and by the mid-1960s, watching was a national reflex. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, 2000, later described the evaporation of civic habits, from club meetings to block parties, in the late 20th century, with television staring at the defendant's table. Porches were not named in the indictment, but they were visible collateral. Suburban planning piled on. Post-war tract developments, like Levittown in New York and Pennsylvania, launched in 1947, standardized small houses with small stoops and big backyards. The backyard became the stage. The Weber kettle grill, invented in 1952, turned patios into theater in the round for burgers, where neighbors rarely wandered in unless explicitly invited. Zoning codes often required deeper setbacks from the street. Garages migrated to the front and swelled until they became faces wearing two big square eyes and an indifferent smirk. The front porch, even when present, shrank to a gesture. This is the version of the story some people know. Golden Age, decline, the end. That telling leaves out a stubborn fact. The porch refused to go away. And in many places, it never actually left. It persisted in older neighborhoods, along rural roads, and in university towns where Victorian houses weren't replaced by ranches. It adapted as screened-in porches, wrapped around sunrooms and back patios. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Appalachia, the Deep South, and small towns everywhere still displayed entire families on porches for evening summer air. They rocked through the electric ages, with no need to update software. The revival shifted from stubborn habit to policy and fashion, when new urbanists showed up with rules that forced the issue. Seaside, Florida, begun in 1981 by Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, wrote a code that nudged houses to pull their porches close to the sidewalk for sociability. The little panhandle town became a postcard for a different type of suburb. Celebration, Florida, followed. 1994 to 1996, candy coating the recipe for porches around parks and a walkable grid. Old school city planners smirked. Then the real estate numbers walked in. People paid for walkability and for the Instagram of a well-proportioned front porch. By the late 2010s, roughly two-thirds of all new single-family houses built in the U.S. included some kind of porch, according to the U.S. Census Bureau's survey of construction. That percentage rose and fell a few points by region, but the national appetite looked steady. Housing historians like Catherine Bishier in North Carolina, Bernard L. Herman in the Mid-Atlantic, and Henry Glassy in the Appalachian upland documented the porch as material culture, an artifact of craft and community. Preservation agencies, including the National Park Service, produced preservation briefs on how to repair historic porches, underlining their value as character-defining features in old houses. Andrew Jackson Downing's porch sermon started to sound like prophecy. Even the hard-nosed sustainability crowd came around because a deep porch shades windows, cuts heat gain, and enables cross-ventilation. That passive cooling works even when the air conditioning fails. Climate again, wrote the building code. There are moments where porch culture flips from history lesson to live, feed. The Chautauqua movement, launched in 1874 on Lake Chautauqua, New York, established a national habit of intellectual summer camp. Thousands of families poured into wooden cottages, many with porches, to listen to lectures, music, and debate. The movement sprawled into traveling circuits and local assemblies. To historians of everyday life, those porches amount to more than ornaments. They are the front row seats of early mass adult education. The American South kept a porch beat of its own. Blues and old-time country musicians played on porches because porches were the practice rooms and stages they could get. Alan Lomax's field recordings documented singers like Mississippi Fred McDowell playing from front stoops and yards. Their instruments answered the big sky, not an audience of upholstered chairs. Meanwhile, around the Carolinas and Georgia Sea Islands, those porches hosted basket-weaving cooperatives and a robust oral record of stories that anthropology textbooks later mined. On Charleston's single houses, the piazza door at the sidewalk famously led not to an interior hall, but to the private outdoor hall on the side, a form that both invited and excluded in a single gesture. The door said hello to the street while keeping the parlor out of sight. Hospitality and privacy negotiated under a palm fan. Modern safety experts and sociologists added terms for what porch people did naturally. Defensible space, a concept articulated by architect Oscar Newman in the 1970s, argued that urban design should hand residents subtle control of shared spaces to increase safety. Porches performed exactly that function. They extended territory and visibility without aggression. Residents knew passing faces. Strangers stuck out. Crime dropped when porch lights and porch watchers stayed on. The American front porch popped up in product design and branding like a recurring cameo. The white-painted rocking chair became almost its own genre, as instantly legible as a silhouette. The company that built an entire national restaurant chain around a country store fantasy leaned hard on rocking chairs parked along a fake porch, proving that the symbol still sells fried apples and nostalgia better than any billboard. Myths still hang on. The claim that porches declined solely because of air conditioning sticks around like a persistent mosquito in August. The reality is less cinematic and more like a dog pile. Cars, television, changing gender roles, suburban street design, and a national swing toward private backyards scattered the responsibility. Air conditioning helped, no doubt, but it only won because other forces cleared the stands. In the counter-myth column sits another favorite, the idea that front porches have always represented neighborly unity and democratic engagement. They often did, and still do. They also marked boundaries and enforced hierarchies. Plenty of social life gets shaped by who feels safe on the front steps and who doesn't. A porch promises welcome. At the same time, it screens the parlor from sight. The architecture tells on itself. Greek revival porticos in the antebellum South projected value straight off a copy of Vitruvius. Double gallery houses in New Orleans place social life above the flood and above public noise. Italianate villas and Gothic cottages in the 1850s wore porches like lace collars, part shade, part costume. Queen Anne porches sprayed ornament with no remorse because the machine had learned to turn lumber into twirls and hearts by the mile. Bungalows slammed the brakes, thickened the columns, and celebrated rough-cut stone and chunky timber. Modernist houses often ditched the pastiche, but even then, international-style boxes extended sunshades and pilatis that did porch work without using the word. The ranch house's shallow stoop admitted defeat on performance and style, but the subsequent porch addition industry made a living, reversing the mistake. Vinyl columns offered penance on tight budgets. Fiber cement porch decking shook hands with termites and said no thanks. Regional dialects of the porch deserve extra credit. New Englanders used the word piazza for porch well into the 20th century. Mark Twain did the same because he wintered in Hartford and wrote sentences like a man who appreciated shade. In the Southwest, the portal attached to adobe houses made the desert tolerable and sculpted Santa Fe style. On Chicago 3 flats and 2 flats, stacked open porches or enclosed back porches handled summer heat like a means-tested porch annex. In the Midwest, rural farmhouses often displayed L-shaped porches that later got boxed in as 3-season rooms. California invented and reinvented the sleeping porch because nights next to orange groves demanded blankets even when afternoons burned. Florida argued with insects and humidity until the screen room became the default. A cultural object called the lanai in real estate listings, whether or not it spoke Hawaiian. Porch craft kept pace with chemistry. Paint changed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as pigments moved beyond white lead, and thank goodness for that, and binders improved in durability. Linseed oil made way for alkyds and latex. Porch floors developed their own colors. Battleship, gray in the mid-Atlantic and south, because oil-based porch enamel in gray weathered well and did not reveal every scuff. Ceilings acquired a legend. Haint blue, a soft sky-tinted paint on porch ceilings across the south, acted partly as ghost repellent in Gullah and low country folklore, and partly as insect deterrent with mixed scientific support. Practical benefits included the illusion of sky and light. Whether or not the paint confused wasps into steering clear, the ritual remained sticky. Every hardware store in the region carried a shade of it, often bearing poetic names. The Porch sustained catastrophes too. Hurricanes tore them off like hats on Gulf Coast houses and flattened them in North Carolina and Florida. Tornadoes took them politely, or rudely, depending on luck. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake sent stoops and porches sliding. Fire devastated thousands of wooden porches every summer across the country. Preservationists became porch obsessive because replacing one wrong could collapse the whole face of a historic house. The National Park Service's Preservation Brief 45, Preserving Historic Wood Porches, reads like a love letter and a cautionary tale. It urges builders to save original materials when possible and copy the old forms accurately when not. Even dressed in restoration jargon, the affection leaks through. Census tables and building permits add a weirdly satisfying kind of drama. In the 2010 as noted earlier, around 2/3 of new detached single-family houses had porches. In the South Atlantic Division, think Carolinas and Georgia, the percentage often ran higher than national. Patios grew too. It turned out that many new houses wanted both, a front stage and a back refuge. That preference paired nicely with a flavor of zoning reform. In towns that valued walkability, cities like Nashville and Raleigh updated zoning to encourage porches within a set distance from the sidewalk. Older neighborhoods wrote overlay districts, insisting on porch proportions that matched historic blocks. Developers responded because their customers responded. The pandemic turned the volume back up. In 2020, as the world went into quarantine, porches and stoops again became America's safest performance spaces. Porch concerts and birthday parades wheeled past houses, a spectacle repeated from Ithaca Porfest's model, which started in 2007 as a neighborhood music day and spread to more than 100 towns by the late 2010s. Teachers delivered graduation certificates across porch rails. Ministers preached from steps. Politicians stood again at that liminal space between private and public and made promises. The term porch pirate sadly entered the lexicon for package thieves, proof that the threshold remains hotly contested territory. The crash course reminded a plugged-in country that fresh air is non-negotiable. There are photographs from 2020 of string quartets, massed and spaced, performing on Queen Anne verandas, and of neighbors in lawn chairs on the sidewalk, 6 feet apart. The line between stage and audience reappeared like an old road on a drought map. A skeptic might want precise, cut and dry reasons for every turn. Historians provide some. Climate, technology, taste, finance, health, all of them wrote pieces of the script. Learn a few dates and watch the porch appear and vanish like a magic trick that kept leaving a sleeve poking out. 1830s, balloon framing, 1840s, 1850s. Downing, Vogue, Greek Revival porticos, and Gothic/Italianate verandas, 1860s, 1880s. Mass-produced decorative woodwork and wire screens, 1880s, 1910s. Streetcar suburbs and Queen Anne plus bungalow fever, 1900, 1930. Sleeping porches and craftsman common sense, 1930s, 1950s. Minimal traditional, far, and post-war ranch habits. Minimize the front porch, 1954. Air conditioner sales, bust 1 million units, 1950s, 1960s. TV colonizes evenings, and garages greet the street, 1980s, 1990s. New urbanism kids bring porches back with design codes. 2020s. 2/3 of new builds include porches. Porch Fest spreads. COVID-19 revives the performance. Note, the regional constants. In New Orleans, the gallery never stopped. In Charleston, the piazza remained non-negotiable. In small-town North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, if someone inherited grandma's farm and kept the house, they kept the porch. Midwestern towns hugging lakes sustained front porches because sunsets over water require seating. Chicago's 2 and 3 flat neighborhoods maintained polyglot porch life because summer demanded that stairwells exhale. There is no version of American social history that makes sense without the threshold. The front porch archived the country's loudest hypocrisies and most tender rituals. It hosted photographs of newborns and final family pictures before wars. It carried the camera in countless early 20th century albums because light levels outside beat parlor gloom by a mile. It witnessed interracial neighborliness and segregation's cruel mechanics. It hosted women organizing for suffrage and improvement societies, while men pretended the politics lived at the courthouse. It offered respite to factory workers, bone-tired at shift's end, and to farmers whose fields extended right off the steps. A quick fact-check with authority. The term stoop comes from Dutch settlers and remains in New York vocabulary. Piazza, in New England, for porch, is documented in writings by Nathaniel Hawthorne and Mark Twain. Veranda enters English through Portuguese in the 18th century. Andrew Jackson Downing's treatises advocating verandas, published in 1842 and 1850. Calvert Vokes, published in 1857. Gilbert and Bennett pioneered wire screen manufacturing in the 1860s. The CDC marks 1951 as the year malaria was declared eliminated from the continental U.S. Sears kit homes sold roughly 75,000 between 1908 and 1942. McKinley's 1896 front porch audiences totaled roughly 750,000. Harding's 1920 visitors approached 600,000. Television adoption hit 87% of households. By 1960, air conditioning is documented at around 12% of households in 1960, climbing above 60%. By 1990, new urbanist towns like Seaside enforced porch-forward codes. In the 1980s, the U.S. Census Survey of Construction shows about 2/3 of new single-family houses with porches in the 2010s. These signposts clear away the fog and leave the architecture standing in high relief. The porch's cultural kit includes a troupe of humble all-stars. The rocking chair became mortal enemies with mosquitoes and friends with book chapters. The porch swinging since the early 20th century at least, trained generations to negotiate equilibrium together. Fans turned lazily overhead, first powered by belt and pulley contraptions, running to basement motors in the 1910s, and then by quiet electric motors that hummed like contented bees. Thermometers nailed to porch posts, measured to porch posts, measured sweat-soaked loyalty to the ritual. A side table held iced tea, sugar cubes, and arguments about the right lemonade ratio. Someone's radio, later someone's Bluetooth speaker, filtered music through the screen. House numbers gleamed from posts because the porch introduced the home to the street with a firm handshake. Porch details spelled class and region. Cypress and heart pine held up better in the humid south. Redwood and Douglas fir worked figures in the west. Brick piers rose from stone footings with neatly tooled mortar joints. Lattice panels vented the crawl space while keeping feral cats from drowning in shade. Brackets projected shadows at angles that carpenters could recite by heart. Paint took a beating and rewarded careful prep. The painter who knew to prime the underside of the first 2 deck boards before installation saved grief and bills. Building codes learned to insist on porch rail heights within strict ranges, reshaping the look of new houses through safety logic. A thread runs stranger and deeper. The front porch turned out to be the American answer to a universal need, a permeable edge. It is not fully public, like a plaza, not fully private, like a living room. It is a membrane that breathes. Cultures with stronger street life build public living rooms. Cultures with interior obsessions hide behind curtains. The United States, always uncertain whether it is a small town or an empire, constructed a half-outdoor space and poured a civilization into it. The results are messy, human, and inescapable in the photographic record. There is a measurable environmental argument as well. Deep porches reduce solar heat gain on southern and western facades. They protect doors and windows from weather, extending the life of materials. They foster natural ventilation by offering shaded outdoor rooms that make interior temperatures feel cooler. In older houses, they lowered energy loads before electricity even joined the household. Modern net zero designers have rediscovered this and embedded porches, colonnades, and loggias in high-performance projects with the same cheerful outcome that 19th century builders found by rule of thumb. A handful of textbook houses translate this history into wood and paint. The Ocali Plantation, 1836-39, demonstrates a colonnaded facade, not truly a porch but functioning like one, for social display. The Pontalba Buildings, 1849-51, in New Orleans, codify the gallery as part of civic architecture. The Carson Mansion in Eureka, California, completed 1886, flaunts Queen Anne porches as ornate carnival. The Gamble House, 1908 in Pasadena, designed by Green and Green, takes the bungalow porch to an apex of craftsmanship. The typical Chicago 3-flat, with wood porches along the back, speaks to climate and code. A small Sears bungalow in the Midwest with its half-timbered porch posts tells the tale of mail-order domesticity. A 1920s Charleston single house with a piazza door whispers about breezes and eavesdropping. A side-hole New England farmhouse with a shallow entry stoop admits its Puritan ancestry, while a later wraparound addition confesses a fling with the 19th century. The front porch's role in protest and public life grew again in the 21st century. Neighborhood porch meetings organized mutual aid during crises. Civic leaders spoke from front steps for streamed addresses. Civil rights groups long used front steps for visibility when permits for parks and streets were complicated or denied. The visual language of the porch. A human figure at the threshold of home communicated stability and vulnerability in the same frame. It is the most democratic mise-en-scène a camera can find without renting a stage. Even the ergonomics of porch life carry information. Sitting on a porch after dusk resets sleep cycles because the body takes cues from falling light. Noise levels drop. The brain tracks countless micro-movements in trees and on sidewalks that in turn dial down stress. The rise of smartphone life wound up hurting porches less than expected because porch scrolling brought the screen outside. An odd hybrid scene became normal. A friend doom-scrolling left thumb to right while a neighbor strolled past and described the tomato crop. The porch proved that multitasking can be charming, too. Policy folks see the porch differently. In the language of setbacks and build to lines, a house that sits close to the sidewalk creates eyes on the street. A house set too far back with no porch creates a void where nobody watches. Municipalities that write pattern books and form-based codes essentially legislate porch culture back into existence. One property line at a time. It is a strategy used in dozens of towns. From Memphis's Crosstown to Oklahoma City's Wheeler District to Utah's Daybreak. And the effect replicates across demographics. People who prefer a private backyard still get one. People who like a front porch with morning coffee gain a street with walkers and dogs, creating tiny, pleasant rituals of predictability. The internet birthed its own porch analogues. Forums named themselves Front Porch to signal civility. Podcasts borrowed the name and the tone. The front porch became shorthand for neighborly transparency in community programs and philanthropic efforts. Civic tech tools styled themselves as modern porches, where users post, debate, and sift local news. The metaphor stretched because the function beneath it stubbornly refuses to become obsolete. There is also the economic calculation. A well-proportioned front porch is a return on investment machine. In older neighborhoods, measured both in sale prices and in the less quantifiable currency of block pride. House flippers discovered this early and sometimes abused the lesson with glommed-on porticos and sketchy columns. Skilled contractors with a preservation conscience reversed the uglier mistakes. Real estate listings learned to put front porch high in the bullet list because buyers read it as neighborliness telegraphed into architecture. Front porches crop up in American literature and film across genres, not because of set decorators' laziness, but because of realism. The camera and the novelist's eye both trust the porch to frame a heartland sincerity, or to complicate it. In To Kill a Mockingbird, porches become tribunals and safe perches. In The Waltons and Friday Night Lights, porches are the medium of family politics. That trope has legs because it documents a straightforward truth. Important conversations do not all happen at kitchen tables. The current swing of the pendulum suggests a few nudges. Architects know that porch depth matters. Less than 6 feet, and it becomes a decorative ledge. 8 to 10 feet, and it turns into a usable room. The number of steps affects the experience. A single step attracts spontaneous chats from passers-by. A taller perch increases privacy and surveillance. Materials decide maintenance rhythms. Durable decking and properly flashed roofs save money for people who live there. Old school details. Ceiling fans, shutters that actually close, railings at comfortable heights. Pay comfort dividends no spreadsheet captures easily. City planners have learned that a street full of porches tolerates narrow lanes and slower traffic gladly, because neighbors reward drivers who behave and shame those who do not. The story contains a satisfying health plot twist. Public health once used porches to fight disease through fresh air. Pandemics and heat waves have again made porches into a resilience tool. As extreme heat days increase across much of the US, shaded outdoor spaces and cross-ventilation return, not as quaint, but as strategic armor. Insurance companies calculating risk in Gulf and Atlantic states pay attention to porch roofs and window protections because a well-designed porch dissipates wind loads and sheds water more gracefully than a blank facade. A complete accounting would be a field guide. It would map where porches survive in cities and document their languages. It would study how often porch lights burn and at what hour. It would compare the sound of summer insects against the hum of compressors. It would count how many neighborhood disputes ended on a porch with lemonade versus how many escalated for lack of a threshold to talk across. Sociologists and historians have already begun the counting. The numbers tend to point the same way. Neighborhoods with active porches often report tighter social ties and lower crime, even when controlling for income and education. None of this grants the porch sainthood. Plenty of porches sit empty beneath dusty swings, because life speeds past at 45 miles per hour and commuters arrive too tired to sit. Others host dozens of packages and no people. Billboards for e-commerce rather than community. Property crimes create anxiety that drives residents inside. When the weather misbehaves for long stretches, porch sitting becomes an act of heroism rather than habit. It helps to be honest about that. Myth-making is pretty, but porches are already interesting under direct light. Here is the simplest way to see the through line. The American front porch is a climate machine, a social instrument, and a cultural symbol that refuses to stay in a single box. It oscillates with technology, but never surrenders. It absorbs new habits, streaming audio, dogs in strollers, package deliveries, and stays legible. It feeds on old ones, rocking at dusk, gossip with the neighbor on a walk, a wave that requires no words, and remains useful. It has multiple passports and an alias in every region. It tells the truth about who Americans imagine themselves to be on their best days. Private citizens who build some part of their daily ritual in public, because privacy without community starves, and community without privacy collapses. Watch an ordinary block on an ordinary summer night. Ceiling fans spin over beadboard ceilings. Painted pale sky. Someone's porch has a pair of chairs at 90 degrees, the geometry of comfortable talk. A mail carrier drops a package and nods. A guitar leans against a post. Kids squeal, playing tag across lawns that ignore property lines by mutual consent. A retired couple drifts on a swing in perfect pendulum time. An early shift nurse steps onto a stoop to feel the air. A teenager on a skateboard salutes with chin up. At the corner, one house sticks out like a small rebuke. Nobody on the stoop, garage yawning toward the street, blank facade offering nothing. The rest of the block edits the mood, back to friendly with the simple practice of being seen. Architects try to write manifestos that change the world. The porch wrote a better 1 through 2 centuries of use, powered by mosquito screens, rocking chair physics, nail guns, and stubborn human biology. That manifesto is blunt. A healthy neighborhood needs a stage. Shade needs a roof. Stories need a place that allows strangers to become neighbors, along a line of floorboards, varnished by feet. A country obsessed with novelty keeps rediscovering the same old technology. A roof on posts and enough room for chairs. The front porch occupies the precise boundary between mind your own business and we're in this together. It is hard to imagine a more American invention, mostly because it was invented everywhere and perfected here by accident. Sweat and a lot of evenings risked on conversation. Our journey through history continues with the religious beliefs of the ancient Etruscans. Rome ran on omens, like it ran on roads. Senators froze mid-debate because thunder rolled over the Capitoline Hill. No one voted until specialists from an older culture read the sky like a spreadsheet. That older culture sat just to the north and called itself the Rasna. Moderns call them the Etruscans. Their religion ran so deep in central Italy that by the time Rome ruled the Mediterranean, emperors still hired Etruscan experts to explain why a lightning strike hit a statue's big toe. A lost library of sacred books lay behind every solemn Roman gasp, every cancelled battle, every uneasy eye lifted to a cloud. The Etruscans believed the universe spoke in signs, not soft signs, blunt, all-caps messages delivered through thunder, monstrous births, cracks in the ground, and sheep livers. Their world was negotiated with the gods, not inspired by them. Things went wrong because someone bungled a ritual comma. Things went right because someone got the sacrifice exactly correct down to the last drop. The result looked obsessive to Greek neighbors and irresistibly useful to Romans. Cicero, arch skeptic and power user of tradition, still cited the Etruscan discipline as the gold standard in divination around 45 Becks. The man wrote policy memos on prodigies before lunch and rhetorical masterpieces after dinner. The cosmic instruction manual that Romans admired came from books the Etruscans attributed to a child prophet who stepped from a miraculous ploughed furrow already fluent in fate. His name in Latin texts is Targus. No invented fairy tale needed. Ancient authors from Cicero to Ovid to Arnobius repeat the origin story with straight faces. The Etruscans called their sacred science the disciplina. In it lived three main divisions: haruspicy from the entrails of sacrificed animals, fulguriology from lightning and thunder, and ritual law that told cities how to be cities without angering something with wings. None of those books survive. They burned in time's library fire. What's left is a scatter of quotes from Roman and late antique authors. A bronze model of a sheep's liver, dug up in 1877 near Piacenza. A linen religious calendar, accidentally preserved as a mummy wrapping, and now in Zagreb, and a bilingual set of gold sheets, unearthed in 1964 at the port of Pyrgi, tying an Etruscan goddess to the Phoenician Astarte, with the bureaucratic precision of a diplomatic cable. Those artifacts carry more weight than a textbook, because they are the textbook. Lightning sat at the top of the omen food chain. Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, described the difference in worldview with dry Roman sarcasm. Greeks thought clouds banged into each other and accidentally made thunder. Etruscans believed the gods used lightning to announce what they planned to do. Cause and effect, reversed. Not weather causing events. Events declared by weather. That logic turned the sky into a court bulletin. It also turned day-to-day politics into a ritual schedule. Rome's Senate sometimes ordered expiation rites because of lightning reported from Etruria. Tiberius consulted Etruscan experts in 24 CE about a thunder omen. Augustus lined up 60 official haruspices in a revived collegium to keep the empire on speaking terms with the clouds. Their sky wasn't just a ceiling, it was a grid. The disciplina divided the heavens into 16 regions, each assigned to particular gods. This framework, templum in the sky, mapped straight down onto ritual space on earth. Priests cut the air with a curved staff, the lituus, and by that trace established a sacred rectangle rotated with the compass. Birds entering from one region promised success. Birds from another region screamed, "Abort mission." Servius, the late antique commentator on Virgil, spelled out the scheme while explaining augural lines. Cicero nodded toward it, with the confidence of a man who both admired and mocked experts, which is to say he used them constantly. The Etruscan cosmos scheduled history in saecula, not millennia. Saecula. A saeculum marked the lifetime of the longest living person, born on a certain day, then standardized by priests into round numbers. Censorinus, writing in 238 CE, preserved the claim that the Etruscan people had been allotted a fixed number of saecula, often said as 10. A whole civilization got a use-by date. That idea put pressure on ritual fidelity, and missed prayer wasn't just a personal oops. It risked burning an entire century off the cosmic timer. The Etruscan pantheon looked familiar to Greek and Roman eyes, and stubbornly local under the hood. At the top sat Tinia, a sky god with thunderbolts in his hand. Uni, a powerful goddess with the authority of Hera and the raw matter-of-fact presence of Juno, matched him in status and sometimes in fury. Menra, older than Athena and explosively practical, blended war, crafts, and patronage of cleverness. The triad, Tinia, Uni, Menva, mirrored the later Roman Capitoline trio of Jupiter, Juno, Minerva for a reason. Etruscan rulers shaped the earliest Roman temples and cult forms in the 6th century BC. The great temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline, dedicated in 509 BC, wore an Etruscan floor plan, a massive podium, deep porch, and triple cellar, built under the last Etruscan kings of Rome, and dressed with terracotta by Vulca of Veii. Rome's god of thunder was introduced to his new hill in distinctly Etruscan clothes. The supporting cast filled out a busy divine family tree. Turan played the glamorous love goddess. Fuflans handled wine, growth, and the kind of ecstatic release that makes farmers and partygoers shake hands. Nethans governed water. Lauren looked like a war god and acted accordingly. Sethlans brought the fire and the metal. Aplu, connected with Apollo, shared the ultraviolet mix of healing and plague. Hercule appeared in scenes the Greeks would call Heraclean, but with Etruscan plot twists, including a famous image of Uni breastfeeding him, adoption by lactation as a pathway to immortality. These names show up, scratched on mirrors, carved on sarcophagi, and stamped into that bronze liver from Piacenza, like icons on a dashboard. Then came the gods, who make even experts sit up straighter. The Dian Voluti, literally the veiled gods, hovered beyond the named pantheon. Seneca hints at them, and later summaries repeat the idea. Even Tinia consulted them before hurling his nastiest bolts. Fate in Etruscan thought didn't just guide kings and cities like a stern aunt. Fate stood above the sky, father's pay grade. In a religion that loved procedure, the acknowledgement of a power beyond the top god reads like a cold wind through an open door. The underworld team arrived on painted tomb walls, fierce, blue, and matter-of-fact. Charon sported a beak nose and a mallet. Vanth, fierce and compassionate with wings and a torch, looked like a battle-hardened guardian angel. Both appear on 4th and 3rd century BC tomb frescoes from Tarquinia and Orvieto as escorts for the dead. Their job focused on transport more than punishment. The Etruscan afterlife didn't glow with moral scorekeeping, the way later religions advertised. Fate dictated the time. Ritual smoothed the passage. Demons made sure the logistics worked. Ita, the lord of the dead, and Phesipni, his queen, show up in inscriptions and on mirrors, but the couriers, not the monarchs, fill the art. The tomb of the blue demons at Tarquinia, dated to the mid-4th century BC, slaps a viewer with ships ferrying souls and scowling escorts, painted an inhuman blue. The tomb of Orcus at Tarquinia presents a court of the dead where heroic figures sit amid grim companions. The message feels practical rather than preachy. Death equals a journey handled by professionals who do not mess around. Funerary scenes in Etruscan tombs rarely wallow in despair. They lean into banquets. The tomb of the leopards from around 470 beach shows couples reclining on couches while musicians work and attendants serve up the good life. The sarcophagus of the spouses from Cerveteri, around 520 BC, captures a husband and wife as equals in the afterlife, arms extended, faces calm, bodies sharing a single curved lid. Greek neighbors gasped at respectable women reclining with men at dinner. Etruscan women attended banquets, drank wine in public, and had their own names engraved on stone. The religion backed a social reality visible in clay and paint. Ancestors needed company, and that company sometimes appeared as a spouse with a confident smile carved by a terracotta master. A different kind of image decorates the tomb of the augurs at Tarquinia, around 530 bes. 2 mourners covered their faces with hands in a gesture of grief, while a masked figure named Fursu, possibly the ancestor of the Latin persona, plays a bloody game with a tethered dog and an armed victim. Scholars draw lines, not arrows, to the origins of gladiatorial games. The visual says ritual games took place at funerals, and those games ran hot. The religious logic lands cleanly. Blood on the ground fed the dead, soothed their shade, and told the living that chaos could be staged and contained. Etruscan ritual swam in details. Libations poured with right hands. Prayers recited with formulas that left no room for improvisation. Sacrifices timed to the calendar, tailored to the deity, and adjusted to the omen. The vocabulary even passed into Latin as legal terms. Piaculum meant a propitiatory offering, intended to cancel guilt or dodge divine fallout. Expiatio took it further with set ceremonies to scrub away a specific offense. Rome imported those terms along with the attitudes that powered them. A lightning strike destroyed a house. The Senate asked the haruspices what the gods demanded. A sheep grazed that happened to grow the right liver offered the best answers. That bronze liver from Piacenza turns the whole system into a handheld explainer. Discovered in 1877 near Gossolengo, about 10 kilometers south of Piacenza. The object measures roughly 12 by 7.5 centimeters and lists more than 40 divine names incised across its surfaces. It's a model of a sheep's liver divided into sections like a pie chart for immortals. The edges mark out the 16 sectors of the sky. The priests studied the color, shape, lobes, and bumps of a real liver, and then mapped them to sections and gods. Fault lines in the flesh signaled anger from a particular quarter. A missing gallbladder spelled doom in one scenario and a tax audit in another. Jean McIntosh Turfer built an entire volume around this and related material in 2012, showing just how systematic the Etruscan approach ran. The tool looks like the world's oddest pocket guide, and that image isn't far off. Apprentices likely learned the names and the logic by running fingers around the edges until the sky sat in their hands. If thunder was the headline, the brontoscopic calendar was the lifestyle section. Nigidius Figulus, a late Republican polymath who collected Etruscan lore and reinvented himself as a Roman Pythagorean, compiled a calendar of thunder omens. His work survives because a Byzantine bureaucrat, John Lidus, copied a Greek version in the 6th century set. Each day of the year comes with a forecast keyed to thunder. Thunder on March 4th signified a bumper vintage in wine. Thunder on July 14th meant the price of grain would rise and women of status would face lawsuits. The dates snap into focus with creepy economy. The style drips with Etruscan specificity, even in later Greek dress. A society that divides the sky into grids and livers, into quadrants, naturally schedules thunder to the day. The surviving Etruscan sacred text with the most raw word count hides in a museum in Zagreb, the Liber Lintius Zagrabiensis. Linen Book of Zagreb wrapped an Egyptian mummy in the Hellenistic period and landed in Croatia by a 19th century trade route, then unrolled under modern eyes to reveal more than 1,000 words in Etruscan. The text reads like a ritual calendar with instructions for sacrifices. It lists months, deities, offerings, and procedures with a bureaucrat's love of columns and a priest's obsession with correctness. No mythic prose floats in the lines. Religion here equals schedule. The fact that it survived because an Egyptian artisan recycled it like an old newspaper would be absurd if it weren't quintessentially ancient Mediterranean. Gods in Etruria answered to local passports, as well as grand titles. Voltumna, probably called Veltha, in Etruscan, presided over the federal sanctuary of the 12 cities, the Fanum Voltumnae. Leaders of the Etruscan League met there to make policy and perform joint rites. The site likely sat near Orvieto, at a place now called Campo della Fiera, where archaeologist Simonetta Stopponi uncovered a major sanctuary complex with layers from the 6th through the 2nd centuries best. The Romans knew Voltumnus and set up his statue in the Forum. Ovid, never one to avoid a shape-shifting story, turned Voltumnus into a god of seasons and change in his fasti. The Roman version smells like literary perfume sprayed over an older, earthier Etruscan cult of regional identity and sovereignty. When the League needed to declare war or peace, they did it under Voltumnus' eye. Trade carried gods with as much ease as amphorae. Apegi, the port of Caere, 3 gold tablets were buried under a temple around 500 to ground, 480 bus, and dug up in 1960. 4 by archaeologist Massimo Palatino and team. 2 tablets held Etruscan, 1 displayed Phoenician. The same dedication poured out in both languages. The Fairy Velianas, the local ruler of Caere, had consecrated a sacred precinct to Uni, identified with Astarte in Phoenician. The text clocked the act to a travelable date with a lunar marker. The gold sheets measure around 19 by 8, 9 centimeters each, and glitter now as brightly in museums as when they hit the soil. The bilingual pairing shows Uni's willingness to accept a foreign name when honoring a political alliance. It also proves that Etruscan religion handled syncretism like a negotiated treaty, not a takeover bid. Greek gods entered the Etruscan world through pottery, artists, and visiting merchants. Ports like Gravisca, the harbour of Tarquinia, hosted sanctuaries to Greek deities, complete with Greek dedications from the 6th and 5th centuries by. Etruscan artisans copied Attic vase painters and then inserted Etruscan plotlines. Achilles becomes Achelon, engraved bronze mirrors. Paris turns a mead, and the judgment of 3 goddesses gets replayed with Etruscan accessories. The result reads like a modern remake that keeps the structure but changes the cast's haircut. The Etruscan Fuflans resembles Dionysus, but smiles from banqueting scenes with a grounded agricultural energy. Grapes tied tightly to soil and kinship, not only to theatre and trance. Religion in Etruria never separated from public life. Priests belonged to the elite. The same families that built tumuli the size of small hills also built sanctuaries with imported Greek columns and homegrown terracotta gods. Rulers called leucomonas, or purple-edged robes, and sat on curule thrones during rites. Ritual law, the parts that Romans later called ritus etruscus, dictated how to found a city. A furrow ploughed with a bronze-tipped plough marked the boundary. Sacred gaps left in the wall became gates. Soil thrown inward formed the first rampart. The gestures announced a contract with the gods, rather than a personal blueprint. Even the brute symbol of Roman authority, the fasces, rods wrapped around an axe, traced to Etruscan insignia of magistracy and ritual power. Romans adopted the kit and the choreography, then told themselves they had always done it that way, because that's what Rome does. Temples in Etruria wore a distinct look. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, writing under Augustus, described the Tuscan temple as a podium, with a deep front porch, wide-spaced wooden columns, and a triple cellar at the back. Most of the drama happened on the front stage, rather than hiding behind a peristyle. Terracotta sculpture exploded across the roofline. The Portinaccio temple at Veii, built around 510-480 base, shows the style in high definition. A nearly life-size terracotta Aplu strides across the ridge, right foot forward, muscles tight, face alive with archaic energy. The sculptor, Volker, probably made it. The whole complex speaks of processions, sacrifices, and public spectacle, not quiet inner piety. The urban religion of Etruria was louder than a lecture and better dressed than a parade. The material record from Etruscan sanctuaries reads like a hospital gift shop mixed with a hardware store. Anatomical votives in terracotta, eyes, ears, uteruses, legs, hands, piled up by the hundreds and thousands from the 4th through the 2nd centuries Bess, at Ve's Portonaccio sanctuary, and at other sites across Etruria. Crowds left parts of themselves in fired clay to ask for healing or to thank a god for a cure. Archaeologists lift layers of ears, like leaves in a terracotta forest. The visual grammar says the gods healed body parts when asked properly, and that the divine economy handled a steady flow of small, precise requests. Rome will later do the same at temples to Aesculapius and Fortuna Primigenia. The habit originated in central Italy, long before Latin started calling the shots. The appeal of Etruscan religion lay in its precision. It promised results when followed exactly. It also offered diagnostics when the weather turned against a city. If lightning struck a shrine on the left, that counted differently than on the right. And if it struck at night in winter, the message changed again. The discipline claimed to classify thunderbolts by type and intent. Seneca wrote about Etruscans distinguishing between bolts that warned, bolts that punished, and bolts that purified. Some late sources even tallied up different categories of thunder, with numbers that read like a menu. The exact schema shifts across authors because the original books were already lost by their time, but the core claim holds. Not all lightning was created equal. Tinia held more than one model in the warehouse. Modern readers meet the Etruscans through a funhouse mirror of Greek and Roman commentary, but the last 2 decades pulled in science to straighten the line. Herodotus, in the 5th century BC, floated the story that the Etruscans came from Lydia in Anatolia. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BC, threw shade on that claim and argued for a native Italian origin. Genetics put numbers under that debate. Studies published in 2019 and 2021, including work by Post and colleagues, showed Iron Age Etruscans genetically similar to contemporary Latins, with steppe-related ancestry like other Western Europeans. In other words, locals. A non-Indo-European language sitting atop an italic genetic profile isn't a paradox. It's a reminder that languages ride on culture and power networks, not on DNA. Their gods were homegrown, with passports stamped by Phoenicians and Greeks who sailed in and out of Tyrrhenian harbors. The Etruscan language itself adds to the atmosphere of secrecy. Though secrecy isn't the right word, strangeness is more accurate. The Etruscans wrote in an alphabet adapted from a Greek model around the 8th century BC, right to left, on stone and clay. Hundreds of inscriptions survive, many short names, dedicatory formulas, labels on grave goods, longer texts like the Liber Lintius and the Cippus Perusinus show syntax and vocabulary that scholars can read to a point but not fully translate without context. Larissa and Giuliano Bonfante turned that partial knowledge into a field guide, not a closed book. Religious words jump out. Ive for offerings, Muni for gifts, Avelin for offerings, Muni for gifts, Avelin for years. On tomb markers, God's names crowd mirrors and bronzes, the technical terms for priests and rites. Lurk but do not sing. The loss of the Disciplina books hurts more because the lost words had jobs to do. Archaeology fills the silence, by holding up objects and pointing to patterns. The great necropoles at Tarquinia and Cerveteri swell with evidence. Tarquinia's Monterozzi Plateau hosts more than 6,000 tombs. Several dozen contain elaborate wall paintings from the 7th through the 3rd centuries. Bice, banquets, dancers, musicians, athletes, fishermen, demons, and mythic figures swirl around stone beds made for the dead. Cerveteris, bandit action necropolis, builds a city of the dead out of carved tufa, streets and house-like tombs included. Some monuments there reach 40 meters in diameter, grassy barrows like earthen crowns. Walking those roads feels like attending an unending religious festival that belongs to the ancestors. Every tomb was a family chapel, every grave, good, a testimony that the afterlife recognized brand, loyalty. Fire and earth alternated as burial technologies. In the Villanovan period, the early Ionovan period, the early Iron Age phase around 900-700 BC that precedes the classic Etruscan culture, cremation dominated. Ashes rested in urns shaped like huts. By the 7th and 6th centuries inhumation took over for much of central Etruria. Cores lay on carved stone beds, surrounded by pottery from Corinth and Attica, weapons, jewelry, and things that made a life comfortable. A city like Chiusi produced canopic urns, with stylized human heads and arms, echoes of Egypt filtered through Italy. The ritual pendulum may reflect shifting concepts of the soul's journey. Cremation reduces and purifies. Burial preserves and furnishes. Either way, the religious belief behind the habit kept its eyes on continuity. The dead didn't vanish. They remained within reach of libations and prayers. The Etruscans built sanctuaries out on borders and in urban cores. They placed them at river crossings, on hilltops, and near ports. Gravisca's sanctuary served sails and merchants. At Tarquinia's harbour, with shrines to Hera, Aphrodite, and Apollo alongside local deities. Marzabotto, an Etruscan town in the Po Valley, founded around the late 6th century BC, shows ritual planning at scale. Its street grid aligns with cardinal directions. Shrines dot quadrants, the templum in the sky, projected onto the ground like a blueprint, and the builders followed it like a set of zoning laws written by priests. Poggio Civitate, near Merlo, unveiled a 7th-6th century bisolite complex decorated with gargantuan terracotta acroteria. Men with big mustaches and wider hats perched on the roofline, casting eyes over ritual courtyards. The models feel like watchmen, not just ornaments. Even a mountain earned a niche in the system. Vei's cult of Suri, a chthonic fire deity, connected to the Roman Soract, a limestone ridge north of Rome, where the Hirpi Sorani, wolves of Soranis, performed fire-walking rites into the imperial period. Ovid and Strabo preserved glimpses of the ceremony. Men walked across burning coal beds, unscourged. Ancient stunt work credited to a god older than Latin songs and resistant to easy translation. Suri underlaid Apollo in some places and stayed stubbornly himself in others. The religious blend never settled into pure Greek or pure Roman clones because the Etruscans owned their geography like a trademark. Roman religion owes Etruscan belief systems more than a wardrobe. The Senate's habit of consulting the haruspices on prodigies lived on under emperors, from Augustus to Constantine. Claudius, Germanicus's awkwardly brilliant uncle, wrote 20 books on Etruscan history in Greek, the Tyrannica. The work vanished, leaving only quotations and later references. Claudius also married into a family, claiming Etruscan roots. and put on the toga picta for triumphs that paraded Etruscan color schemes in front of Roman crowds. The triumph itself, a parade of victory that turned generals into temporary gods and the city into a moving stage, carried Etruscan smell, banners, music, lictors with fasces, laurel crowns, and a gaudy robe, all pointed north, across the Tiber. Some myths cling to Etruscan religion, like barnacles, and ask for a gentle scrape. The old story that the Etruscans were morbidity-obsessed necromancers, collapses under the weight of banquet scenes, and love goddesses lounging on mirrors. Yes, their demons filled walls, and their priests read livers. They also danced, played double flutes, and painted couples with affection and equal status. Another hitch, Etruscans, as merely derivative of Greeks. Their gods sometimes bear Greek names in Latin texts because Roman authors used Greek as a translation layer. Underneath the gloss, Tinia stands, not Zeus in a Tuscan hat. Menva breathes out of Bronze Age central Italy, with attributes that later wedding dresses could not smother. The Pyrgi tablets prove they negotiated divine identities with strategy, not spinelessness, syncretism for them. Worked like a treaty, not an invasion. Ancient authors who lived under Christian rule left comments that read like negative Yelp reviews. Arnobius and Augustine mentioned the Etruscan discipline as a powerful and pernicious superstition. They meant it. The system still worked, 2 centuries into the Common Era, at a level that made bishops nervous. Roman bureaucrats kept men on staff who could explain a comet's meaning in terms that moved budgets and garrisons. A worldview that left no event, spiritually meaningless, clashed with a theology that demanded a single source for truth and authority. Destroy the old library, and one more competitor leaves the field. The survival of stray paragraphs in hostile hands feels like an act of cosmic irony, straight out of a brontoscopic footnote. The gods in Etruria accepted offerings with an eye for style. Bronzes from workshops in Volti, Prato and Volsini carry dedications to deities in etched letters, as crisp as a signature on a contract. A small bronze statuette of a votary might raise a hand in prayer or present a libation cup. The pose freezes ritual into metal. Mirrors with incised myth scenes were not just makeup helpers. They worked as gifts to a goddess, often Turin or Uni, their polished faces throwing a worshipper's face into a mythic world where lesser spirits, winged female companions of fate and love, hang around the margins. Lassa Vecuvia appears again and again as a helper of Turin. The iconography blends the practical with the enchanted, without shame or apology. Religious space defined civic space. An augural inauguratio installed a magistrate by inscribing a templum on the sky and ground, then inviting the gods to confirm the choice with signs. If the birds refused, the inauguration paused. Founding a city repeated a cosmic origin, but on a human scale. Plows, augurs, and sacrificial victims showed up as reliably as surveyors and masons. The founding ritual of Rome, the Sulcus Primigenius, carved by Romulus on the Palatine in later myth, matches what Etruscan ritual manuals prescribed in sterner prose. That isn't coincidence. Etruscan kings of Rome, in the 6th century Bess, encoded their rituals into Roman civic DNA, and even when later Romans told national myths, the old rites kept bleeding through like stubborn ink under a fresh coat of paint. Some Etruscan gods preferred masks over portraits. Citra appears on the liver of Piacenza, and a few inscriptions, a figure that tempted Roman writers to equate him with Saturn, but resisted full capture. The line between identity and function runs differently in this pantheon. A divine name can show up as a job title at one site and a personified figure at another. Voltumna works as a regional high god and a civic rally point. Suri acts as underworld fire and as a specific mountain's personal rage. The Dain Volutiova as cosmic auditors. The result feels more like a network of powers than a strict family tree with a holiday seating chart. That flexibility gave Etruscan religion more staying power when politics shifted. Ritual attention to omens did not always push societies to conservative paralysis. Etruscan religion used divination as a steering wheel, not just a brake pedal. When prodigies announced divine anger, the manuals offered remedies, substitute victims, vows, processions, and building projects poured out to mop up cosmic spills. When auspices favored a plan, leaders launched campaigns and marriages with their heads held high. The gods wanted attention. They did not demand immobility. Augustine sneered that if Etruscan haruspices ever admitted the gods did things for their own sake, and not just to send signs, their art would collapse. He accidentally described a worldview where communication stood at the center. The gods signaled. Humans replied. Ritual kept the exchange polite. Art picks up where texts go mute. One Etruscan mirror shows Minerva standing in armor, scene labeled with her name, supervising the healing of a wounded hero. Another shows Turan near a naked lover, while a lasser lingers just off stage. Yet another depicts the reunion of Aeta and Philsippne, a domestic scene in the underworld, sidestepping horror for intimacy. Collect enough of these pieces, and a strong outline of beliefs appears. Love matters. Valor matters. Fate comes with paperwork. Death delivers a journey, and not a courtroom verdict. The jealous, ranting king of heaven never barges in. Tinia throws lightning with intent, but not with soap opera drama. When Charon raises his hammer, it reads more like a toll booth than a torture chamber. The economy of miracles and omens required specialized labor. Haruspices trained for years. Augurs knew the geometry of the templum better than any surveyor with a groma. Ritual artisans knew which animal suited, which god, and which season. A white bull might appease a sky god. A black sheep soothed underworld powers. The sacrificial knife had a name and a history. The axe used in foundation rites reflected a memory of older mythic lumberjacks. The script sat in heads, not in a central binder, which is why the loss of the disciplina texts stings, but doesn't erase the system from the earth. The living ritual trained generation after generation until Roman emperors put it on the state payroll. People today sometimes squint at Etruscan liver reading and file it under ridiculous. The same people glance at a weather app 7 times a day and refuse to launch a picnic if the algorithm shows lightning 11% probable. The Etruscans built their weather app out of clay and tradition and called it religion. The accuracy rate wasn't the point. The organized attention mattered. A city that halts to listen to thunder has already decided that community outranks impulse. Etruscan belief translated that decision into civic ceremony. Rome borrowed the ceremony because it worked, just as Rome borrowed aqueducts from engineers and diapers from reality. No grand canon of Etruscan myth literature survives, but small myths add up. Tages, the prophetic child from the plough, returns in art and in Roman comment. Virgoia, a prophetic female figure, appears in later fragments, tied to land law and boundary stones. A line from her teaching insists that moving a boundary marker equals sacrilege with cosmic consequences. Farmers understand that ethic in their bones. The god Salvans, patron of woodlands and boundaries, guards those markers in inscriptions with the gravity of a bailiff. The religious investment in limits and layout echoes through urban planning, land division, and the placement of graves. Order. but not sterile, order. The order of orchards, vineyards, and streets lined with ancestors. The Etruscan League's curated identity, broadcast through common rites at the Fanum Voltumnae, did not prevent intercity rivalry. Veii and Rome fought for centuries. Tarquinia raided and negotiated with neighbors by turns. Volsony fell to Roman aggression in 264 BICE and had its elite deported, a messy finale captured in Roman sources with smug satisfaction. Religion did not act as a magic shield. It acted as a language for triumph and consolation. When temples fell, Romans sometimes shipped the gods to Rome with official invitations, a practice called evocatio. Jupiter of Veii certainly crossed the Tiber as a statue. The psychological logic tracks. Honor a god by setting him up in first-class housing, and he may accept his transfer. A Roman general could then claim the god authorized the city's fall. Etruscan religion accommodated that mid-siege diplomacy because it assumed gods preferred proper care and skilled service to a burning roof. The calendar shaped time along agricultural lines. Festivals clustered around planting, growth, and harvest. Offerings matched seasons. Spring saw vows for health and crops. Summer baked processions into dust and sweat. Autumn tasted of new wine, poured to fooflans. Winter turned to the dead, to the underworld, and to long rituals held indoors. The Liber Lintius structure hints at monthly cycles of rites. Even the brontoscopic calendar, by Nigidius, sits on a 365-day scaffold. Etruscan religion wraps the year like a belt snug against the belly of the land. The system tolerated paradox. Fate overrules gods, yet ritual persuades gods to soften fate's edges. Demons escort the dead without moralizing, yet funerary games draw blood to honor them. Gods wear Greek masks, yet Etruscan names hold the stage. The underworld, painted with fangs and blue skin, looks terrifying, yet tombs read as living rooms for eternity. A culture capable of holding paradox built a religion that absorbed trade shocks, military defeat, and intermarriage without losing its accent. Romans noticed, Greeks noticed. The accent still rings in the vocabulary of modern archaeology, where words like tumulus, canopic urn, and Tuscan order carry Etruscan fingerprints. Debunkers of easy romance should take a bow at one more point. The Etruscans did not vanish because a curse expired at the end of a cosmic lease. They got absorbed. By the late 4th and 3rd centuries Rome's wheels rolled over central Italian hills. Etruscan cities negotiated, fought, lost battles, won treaties, provided cavalry, sent boys to Roman schools, and started wearing Roman names as comfortably as good shoes. Religion pivoted. Haruspices served the new overlords. Local gods accepted Latin titles and Roman festival dates. The discipline retreated indoors or went imperial. By the time Livy wrote his 1st century BICE history, stories of prodigies and expiations flooded the narrative like bad harvest years. Etruscan experts appear in his pages as the serious uncles everyone calls when the baby screams with a fever. The baby happens to be the Roman state. Artists in late Etruscan cities still carved what they believed. In Volterra around the 2nd century urn-lids show couples propped on elbows, watching with alert eyes. Grimacing figures called ombra, shadow souls, glance up from the urn's bodies. A god named Laran, or a demon named Tuchulcha, might appear in relief. The language carved across the stone names the dead and sometimes counts their years. Avalex, XV, the head count of years, matches the head count of Saecula. Time sat heavily on everyone's chest by then. Rome's calendar with its consuls and censuses pressed down and Etruscan lists worked to keep local rhythm alive. The reach of Etruscan religious art scared no one in the Renaissance. Collectors loved it. Alessandro Farnese amassed a trove of mirrors and bronzes. 19th century archaeologists such as George Dennis tromped across tomb fields and wrote about wine and walls with Victorian enthusiasm. Massimo Palatino, in the 20th century, sorted chaos into a discipline. Nancy Thompson de Grumman's work on Etruscan myth and sacred history turned dusty images into narrative frameworks with footnotes. Larissa Bonfante recalibrated assumptions about Etruscan women by staring at art until it looked back with a human face. Jean McIntosh Turfer pulled the brontoscopy calendar out an academic corner and set it under clean light. The authority to speak about Etruscan religion belongs to the objects as much as to the sentences. The world of the Etruscans survives in artifacts with the clarity of thunder under blue skies. Gold tablets at Pyrgi, a terracotta at Aplu, striding on a temple roof at Veii, a bronze liver from Piacenza, covered in immortals' names. Tombs at Tarquinia, where leopards watch dancers with black spots and smug faces. A painted demon in the tomb of the Blue Dems, glaring like a nightclub bouncer. A winged vanth on a mirror, who could outstare any angel in a Renaissance annunciation. A linen book in Zagreb that used to be a mummy wrapping and now acts like a resurrected calendar. The scraps add up. They shout through 2.5 millennia. That belief once organized a country where Tuscany now pours wine for tourists. Modern humor likes to imagine ancient religion as cosplay for festivals. The Etruscans never played at belief. They played festival games that risked blood. They read omens that cancelled elections. They built temples that framed city skylines and sunk money into roofing tiles that shone in the sun. They staffed sanctuaries with priests who tracked schedules more faithfully than accountants track quarters. Their gods sat at the dinner table, not as cute salt shakers but as powers with appetites and moods. Their demons walked into funerals like ushers who did not smile. Their ancestors reclined under stone lids that looked like mattresses. The entire setup rolled out of the workshop of an ancient people who decided that a world of signs beat a world of noise. Take a final look at Rome's origin story from a religious angle, and the Etruscan fingerprint glows neon. The kings of Rome in the 6th century Barsh, Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, came from Etruscan Tarquinius. Their building programs turned Rome from huts to urban center. The capital's great temple anchored Roman religion in an Etruscan architectural rhythm. The ritual staff, the liturgus, kept slicing the sky at inaugurations for centuries. Lictors and farces marched in front of magistrates, like a walking Etruscan emblem repainted in Roman red. The toga praetexta and the toga picta draped Roman officials and triumphers in Etruscan fabric, literally and metaphorically. Even the little detail of seating Roman elders on curuled chairs during games carries the explanation that Etruscan ritual loved the symbol so much that it traveled intact. Scholars still argue over missing pieces. The exact number of thunder types in the Libri Fulgurales, the precise location of the Fanum Voltumna before excavations gave Campo della Fiera its case file, the relationship between Suri and Aplu at Veii, the dating of specific tombs when pottery styles blur across decades, the reading of lines in the Liber Lintius, where a crease has shaved off a god's name. The arguments energize the field. A religion that thrived on classification and interpretation refuses to lie still under one explanation. That's appropriate. The gods of Etruria never blurted their intentions in a single sign. They layered signals. Priests layered replies. Ancient people loved to leave small things in big numbers. Etruscan sanctuaries reflect that. human truth, hundreds of miniature vessels, thousands of terracotta anatomical pieces, piles of broken cups from ritual meals, little bronze figurines, lined up like ranks of faithful petitioners. Each object equals a person confronting luck and asking for a nudge. When placed together, they declare a collective religious psychology that moderns can recognize without translation. Prayers for safe childbirth, ples for healthy eyes, thanks for a healed leg, hopes for a good harvest, oaths sworn at a boundary stone, forgiveness sought after a misstep, answered with a piacula, offering precise to the rule book. The details read ancient. The heart reads familiar. The Etruscan underworld crew deserves one more look, because they never left pop culture alone. Charon, the mallet-bearing demon, shares a name with Greek Charon in Latin texts, but behaves like a bouncer rather than a boatman on urns from Volterra. His beak nose and grim jawline stare across time with a confidence that an algorithm would tag as not friendly. Vanth, always winged, always alert, sometimes holds a scroll, fate's receipt, a torch in her other hand, lights caves and paths. She doesn't punish, she guides. She looks like someone worth knowing at the end of the line. Tuchulcha, a rarer creature with donkey ears and snake hair, turns up on a painted tomb of Orca scene, like a cameo from a horror director with a sense of humor. These images make a point. The journey has staff, meaning attaches to the escort as much as to the destination. A modern museum day in Florence or Rome reveals Etruscan religion hiding in plain sight. The National Archaeological Museum of Florence hangs mirrors in a case where gods introduced centuries before Socrates hold court in incised lines as delicate as pencil. The Villa Giulia in Rome hosts the sarcophagus of the spouses from Cerveteri, clay lovers who refuse to look like funerary furniture. The Cloaca Maxima runs a few blocks away, a Roman sewer with Etruscan engineering bones. Religion and infrastructure intertwined in a way that would make a city planner tear up a little. At the Capitine, a model of the early temple of Jupiter smiles with an Etruscan of Jupiter, smiles with an Etruscan accent. Street names echo older cities. Veii, Caere, Tarquinia. Few capitals in the world so thoroughly wear another culture's religious suit without credit lines in neon. The Etruscans have always been described as mysterious. The word flatters and obscures. The mystery comes from loss, not from some ancient habit of secrecy. Their beliefs stand in plain sight, wherever tomb paintings survived and bronze tools escaped, melting pots. What the Etruscan religion believed can be described without gimmicks. The gods exist and send signs. The world is a temple laid out with cardinal precision. Fate sits above gods, but the gods listen. Ritual matters more than myth. The dead travel under escort. Ancestors like a good party. Cities require ceremony to be real. The sky owns a grid. A sheep's liver holds a map. Thunder delivers memos, and if the memo lands on the wrong desk, a priest knows how to forward it with the correct cover note and a sacrificial lamb. Every culture chooses a metaphor for the world. The Greeks picked drama and debate. The Romans picked law and conquest. The Etruscans picked correspondence. Priests read messages. Magistrates replied. Gods acknowledged. Citizens obeyed the protocol. The exchange purred along until the 2nd century Bas, when Rome called the shots for everyone and filed responses in Latin. The Etruscan discipline didn't disappear. It went corporate. It put on a Roman stamp and worked the imperial help desk. Emperors kept the number handy. Governors used it to handle freak weather. A ritual carved into a city's founding ceremony survived under marble and Latin inscriptions. because stone holds patterns better than paper. Here's the last reveal. The religion that obsessed over livers and lightning created a social world where women reclined at banquets, where couples smiled on their own sarcophagi, where the dead received professional guides instead of hellfire, where gods wore local names without shame, and where politics paused for thunder. That combination still feels radical. The ancients, sometimes, look like a future that modern life keeps almost reaching. Etruscan belief turns out to be less a mystery than a manual for paying attention. The sky speaks, the earth answers. Somewhere between a bronze liver and a painted demon, a civilization learned to live as if the universe sent messages and courtesy mattered. That is not quaint. That is a survival strategy, dressed in terracotta and written in a language that refuses to die, even when almost no one can read it. Archaeologists will pull more from the soil. Campo della Fiera's layers will give up prayers burned into clay. New tombs at Tarquinia will reveal musicians no one has heard for 24 centuries. Someone will spot a god's name on a shard and tighten a line in the Liber Lintius translation. A Roman inscription will mention an Etruscan priest by name and make a collegium come alive down to the number of seats. Data points will continue to climb. In the meantime, the outline stands. The Etruscan religious system turned central Italy into a conversation with its gods, fought like a city, and loved like a household. Rome learned the script and delivered it to an empire. Thunder rolled. People looked up. Specialists arrived. The sacrificial victim bled into the bowl, and someone read meaning into it with the same seriousness a modern reads legal fine print. The gods of Etruria would have approved. They always liked a citizen who followed directions. Next, let's turn our attention to ancient Roman bath culture. Rome did not invent the gym. Rome invented the blockbuster spa that doubled as a newsroom, a snack bar, a startup incubator, a dating app, and an imperial brag that boiled water with the confidence of a superpower. By the late Empire, the official city lists recorded 11 vast thermae and 856 smaller balnea operating in Rome alone. That translated to an urban ritual with marble, steam, and a whole lot of gossip. And none of it looked like a bubble bath. The timeline snaps into focus the moment Marcus Agrippa shows up. As Aedile in 33 Bess, he cleaned Rome's sewers, repaired aqueducts, and by 25 Bess, opened the city's first truly monumental public baths. Ancient authors credited him with bankrolling 170 bathhouses and 700 fountains across the city, a civic flex carved into the urban fabric. He even sought to wonder. He even supplied free oil for bathers. The message landed without subtlety. Warm water equals political warmth. Augustus smiled. The public swooned. The template was set. Fast forward, and emperors are throwing down. Bath complexes, the size of small towns. Caracalla's thermae, dedicated in 216 C, sprawled inside a walled precinct, roughly 337 by 328 meters. The central bath block alone rose in concrete vaults more than 30 meters high, a space engineered to make human bodies feel tiny and the imperial budget feel infinite. Archaeologists estimate it could accommodate about 1,600 bathers. At once, the baths of Diocletian opened around 306 Su, scaled that up to a reported 3,000. This was Rome doing leg day with architecture. But the story breathes best in the details. A typical afternoon at a serious Roman bathhouse ran like this. Step off the street into the palestra, the open-air exercise yard. Watch men toss the light leather ball in a trigon game. Hear the sharp count as it whistles from hand to hand. Spot the guy swinging halters, the Roman ancestor of dumbbells, with a studied look that said both discipline and performance. Martial's epigrams teased the same characters 2,000 years ago. Nothing changes. Through the palaestra, the apodarium, waits a changing room with wall niches and pegs. A slave, the capsarius, hovers over cloaks like a hawk with poor job security. Martial rants about bathhouse thieves. So often it reads like a public service announcement. The crime was common enough to earn an occupational nickname, the fur balnearius. Someone always grabbed the tunic that looked better than their own. Inscribed curses about stolen sandals turn up with the same wounded righteousness as lost AirPods rants. Inside, the ritual unfolds with a precision that would warm any engineer's heart. The tepidarium, a warm transition room with glowing light bouncing off colored marble panels. The caldarium, a hot room cranked by the hypercost to temperatures that could push well above a modern sauna. The floor floats on a forest of little brick pillars, pilae, and the walls hold terracotta tubes, tubuli, all pumping hot air from the braziers roaring in the praefurnium. Slaves stoke the furnaces non-stop. The floor is toasty. The sweat arrives on cue. Then the unctor, the oiler, appears with a flask of infused olive oil. No soap. The Romans did not scrub with lather. They massaged oil into the skin and then scraped it off with a curved bronze strigil, hauling off sweat, dust, and dead skin like peeling plastic wrap from a new phone. Greek athletes had done it for centuries. Rome scaled it with retail options. Perfumed oils with myrrh or nard sat in little glass flasks made in Syrian workshops. A microeconomy that filled Monte Testaccio with the broken amphorae of an empire that moved olive oil by the tens of millions of litres. Pliny the Elder described soap from Gaul, but mostly as a hair-styling product. Everyday Roman baths ran on olive oil and friction. That silky sheen across a stone torso in a museum was not a gym selfie. It was a maintenance regime. The plunge into the frigidarium jolted the nervous system awake again. Cold water pounded out of bronze spouts, sculpted as lion heads. The pool sometimes illuminated by direct sunlight because architects had rotated the whole building to catch the day. The natatio, an open-air swimming basin, stretched across one end of the grand plants. At Caracalla, the natatio formed a stage framed by colossal columns. At Pompeii's Stabian baths, the natatio lived right behind the palaestra, a smaller version marked by practical elegance. Different scales, same choreography. Everything ran on water and fire in quantities that would make a utilities manager clutch their clipboard. The aqueducts did the heavy lifting. Frontinus, the water commissioner, around 97, bragged in De Aqueductu that Rome drew from 9 major aqueducts at the time, each measured in quinaria, and all told, delivering on the order of hundreds of thousands of cubic meters a day. The Aqua Marcia carried particularly sweet water, and for Caracalla, a branch called the Aqua Antoninia piped a dedicated supply straight to those marble pools. Gravity did the work through arcades and tunnels so finely graded that water obeyed. Without pumps, a civilization quietly balancing dozens of kilometers of precise slope. A myth sits in the corner like a bathhouse rumor and deserves to be toweled off. The water was not a stagnant soup left to fester for weeks. Large Roman baths ran on a constant flow model. Fresh water in, dirty water out, trickling through overflow channels and into sewers that led, eventually, to the Tiber. The caldaria and tepidaria were essentially heat exchangers, housed in rooms gorgeous enough to be palaces. Not everything approached modern sanitation. The high traffic meant eye infections and skin irritations were occupational hazards, but a steady inflow plus an obsessed engineering core produced pools that turned over water regularly in the big complexes. Archaeological drains from Caracalla look like the command lines of an operating system. This was not a medieval duck pond. Some of the best sensory data on bath life comes from Seneca, who lived over a small bathhouse and loathed the noise. In letter 56, he unleashed the rant of the millennium, the swish of water, the grunts of athletes, the screech of the depilator, yanking out hair, the barber's gossip, the sausage seller's shouts, and the occasional splash when someone misjudged a step. The wellness soundtrack of antiquity was not pan flutes and whale song. It was commerce and banter, ricocheting off barrel vaults. Gender rules occupied a messy middle between moral panic and practical design. Early Republican baths often separated men and women entirely, or admitted them at different hours, a habit still visible at Pompey's Forum baths, with distinct male and female sections carved like mirror images. Mixed bathing did exist in parts of the empire, enough to trigger periodic indignation and edicts. The so-called Historia Augusta credits Hadrian with limiting it, a source that needs a salt shaker but mirrors later legal texts trying to split the schedules. Wealth or bribes could bend reality. Inscribed price lists sometimes charged women more. The arrangement underlined a reality about Roman social life. Public virtue loved to wag a finger while private practice did exactly what it wanted behind a curtain of steam. The price of admission, want break a marble piggy bank, a typical entry, attested by writers like Martial and the jurist Ulpian, hovered around 1 quadrans, a quarter of an as, cheaper than a snack for most men of the city. Women often paid more, and sometimes a lot more, a sting that underscores how even subsidized luxuries reproduced social hierarchies. Emperors loved to stunt by making entry free on festival days, or even permanently in a given bath. Agrippa famously left endowments that covered oil for the masses. The baths turned imperial budgets into warmth on the skin, bread and circuses, and steam. Themae were also libraries, literally. Caracalla's complex housed twin libraries on opposite sides of the main block, east and west, likely Greek and Latin collections. The libraries of Trajan's baths did the same. Book rolls, lecture benches, moral philosophy within sprinting distance of a cold plunge. Modern wellness architecture gropes for this vibe and usually lands on eucalyptus towels. Rome did eucalyptus plus the Farnese Hercules. That sculpture and its equally muscular partner, the Farnese bull, were excavated from Caracalla's bath precinct in the 16th century, banished to museums only because the Renaissance built a new religion around collecting. The original design had them standing in a garden loggia, bodies oiled in marble, an allegory of strength to pair with the literal burn in the palastra, the business floating around. The business floating around the steam mattered as much as the sculpture. Deals were struck, lawsuits were rehearsed, poets recited, pickpockets worked the crowds, and the bath staff formed a miniature labor ecosystem. Balnatores ran the front door. Unctors, oiled depilators, wielded tweezers with terrifying commitment, and the furnace slaves sweated in their own private hell behind the walls. An entire wage hierarchy emerges from Diocletian's edict on maximum prices of 301. C, which names crafts from barbers to bath attendants and sets their maximum fees and pays. The edict reads like a government trying to put a lid on inflation and status anxiety with the same clenched jaw. It never works, but it leaves receipts. The changeover from exercise to bathing pulled in physicians and health trends. Galen, the 2nd century doctor who owned the term authority in Roman medicine, praised moderate bathing regimes and warned about extremes. Celsus, writing earlier in the 1st century C, left advice on cold plunges and fevers. People treated the bath like a pharmacy with architecture, sweating it out in the Laconicum. A dry heat room became a cure, cooling quickly in the frigidarium counted as a system reset. Stories of elders collapsing after a sudden plunge traveled the empire, the ancient version of viral cautionary tales. Enthusiasm never waned. It only learned to lean on ramps when the floor got slippery. To understand the Roman bath without the engineering is like describing a ship without mentioning water. The hypokos deserves fanfare. Fires were lit under suspended floors, supported on little pillars about 60 centimeters high. Heat rose and was channeled through wall flues into domes so audacious that modern architects still feel a tremor of envy. The Caldarium at the Baths of Diocletian carried a dome 45 meters wide, later reused by Michelangelo as the nave of Santa Maria degli Angeli e dei Martiri. Michelangelo virtually wrapped a church around a Roman hot room, and the building barely noticed, because the bones were that good. Frescoes ended up where steam once billowed. The conversion quietly admits what everyone knows: Roman concrete-built sets for gods. Renaissance geniuses just moved in. Water flowed to match the vaults. The pool volumes of a single imperial complex could hit several thousand cubic meters, and the throughput per day would make a drought manager twitch. Scholars have calculated that Rome's aqueduct network likely delivered roughly 1 million cubic meters of water daily by the 2nd century C, based on Frontinus's figures and later additions. Not all of it splashed into baths. A lot watered gardens, supplied fountains, and fed private houses lucky enough to run a lead pipe, stamped with an imperial name, right into the atrium. But the baths gulped a staggering share, and the pipes continually revealed the power structure. The stamp on a lead fistula told a story. The emperor's name announced public distribution. A senator's name announced clout. Cue the modern panic about lead poisoning. The pipes were lead, yes. So were the storage tanks and the solder. But Rome's water was hard and quickly deposited a layer of calcium carbonate inside the pipes, a mineral crust that protected water from direct lead leaching. Chronic lead exposure in the elite happened more through cookware, glazes, and sweeteners like sapa boiled down in lead vessels, not through the raging river flowing through public baths. The empire had many problems. The frigidarium was not chelating anyone's IQ wholesale. The touchpoints between urban bath culture and local traditions outside Italy form one of the best mashups of the Roman world. In Britannia, at Aquae Sulis, today's Bath, the hot spring that Celts had dedicated to Sulis, long before Caesar's press team even booked a ferry, was wrapped in Roman masonry. Between about 60 and 70 C and rededicated to Sulis. Minerva, a divine hybrid with provincial charm and metropolitan swagger. The Great Bath, limestone lined and about 1.6 meters deep, steamed at the heart of a precinct where supplicants packed cursed tablets into the sacred spring, asking the goddess to track down stolen cloaks with ruthless efficiency. Sulis Minerva had time for petty justice. A goddess who watched over a bath complex did not waste energy pretending to be above it all. In North Africa, the pattern glittered under a different sun. Lepacy's Magnus Hadrian baths opened in the 120 SC with polished stone that glows orange in photographs, because North African quarries know drama. The bath building stacked rooms along a central axis with the same choreography as in Rome, but the courtyards and sea breeze cast the ritual in a warm light that reads as generous rather than grandiose. Africa Proconsularis produced bath complexes that show off the wealth of cities like Sabratha and Dugga, each a civic muscle. Flex funded by local elites who learned quickly that hot water won friends and influenced voters. Meanwhile, in the Greek East, the line between gymnasium and bath complex blurred so fully that archaeologist Fikret Yegel coined the compound term bath gymnasium to describe what the signage already knew. Athletic training, lectures, bathing, and dining rhymed in spaces tuned to overlapping rhythms of use. It was a daily campus. Romans did not so much colonize Greek habits as they turned the volume knob and installed better plumbing. Every age has its myths. Roman baths stock more than their share because they blend sensuality with scale, and the mind loves to project. The donkey milk bath sits at the top of the list. Pliny the Elder did write that donkey milk helped the complexion, and he was not above hawking weird cures while cataloguing nature in 37 volumes. Cleopatra's alleged immersion in whole cisterns of milk reads like a later glam embellishment. Cleopatra was a Greek-speaking Macedonian queen of Ptolemaic Egypt, not a Roman spa enthusiast, and her prior team did not need lactose to sell allure. Roman bathers stuck with olive oil. The myth sticks because it snaps to a mental picture, straight out of perfume advertising. The real thing was practical, oily, and accompanied by the metallic zip of a bronze scraper. Another persistent meme insists that all Romans bathe together in some libertine slurry. The erotic frescoes in the suburban baths at Pompeii, discovered in the 19th century and promptly locked in the so-called secret cabinet in Naples for decades, certainly pumped up the association. Those paintings arranged above the lockers in the male changing room depict sexual positions with industrious clarity. Scholars now argue they functioned as a wayfinding system, a visual labeling tool, more than an instruction manual. If someone could not read a number, they could remember the picture over their cubby. They also advertised that the environment tolerated bawdy humor. Pompeii always plays it loud. Erotic art in one bath does not make every tepidarium a brothel. Prostitution did brush against bath culture, because prostitution brushed against the entire Roman cityscape. Satirists like Juvenal and moralists like Seneca barked about it, and Christian writers grumbled while also admitting that bathing per se was not a sin. Tertullian, a 2nd century Christian polemicist who could find an argument inside a loaf of bread, warned believers about the moral hazards in the baths but did not declare bathing off limits. Later, after Constantine emperors kept building baths, the baths of Constantine on the Quirinal went up in 315 C. Christians used public baths while gradually channeling the culture toward modesty. The late antique moral struggle looked more like editing than deletion. The bath day became habit, especially for urban males, with the afternoon free after a morning of business. Offices opened at dawn. By the 11th hour on the Roman clock, which roughly meant mid-afternoon, the bathhouse fires had the hot rooms at temperature, and staff had oiled the benches. Men rolled in after the courts closed, and the forum emptied. For the poor, it was a rare hot environment in a life lived in cold rooms. For the middling, it was daily punctuation. For the rich, it was an expected part of the performance of health. A city that valued the suntan lines from the palestra also valued the glow of the frigidarium. The daily rhythm fed the economy of oil jars, towels, sandals, snack vendors, and strigils clanking in a bucket. Snacks always wait just off camera. In Roman life, sausage sellers hawked spiced links. Bakers carried warm loaves. A small cup of wine laced with resin or herbs hovered near the end of the sequence, like a cross-cultural truth stamped into DNA. The phrase balneim, venom fleshed out in a mosaic mentality, bathe, then drink, or the other way around, depending on the neighborhood and the personality type. Critics always roamed. Pliny the Younger praised country baths and complained about the air in city ones. Seneca rolled his eyes at luxury when he saw cheap virtue stapled over imported marble. The point lands because the choice between moderation and maximalism lives inside every generation. The baths gave the Romans a mirror to argue with themselves. The mirror was polished stone and still better at telling the truth than any pundit. On the technical side, few figures hit like a fuel bill. Heating a mega-complex took wood by the wagon load. Ancient sources do not provide clean daily tonnage numbers, but reconstructions suggest that the keeping Caracalla at full heat in winter demanded multiple furnaces roaring for hours, each fed by a constant stream of wood. Rome's hinterland groaned under that demand, and the kilns, bakeries and household braziers of a city that could hit 1,000,000 mouths. At peak, forest management and supply chains absorbed the pressure for centuries. The price was an ever-widening radius of resource extraction, and harbors jammed with ships loaded to the gunwales with fuel and oil. Roman comfort ran on global logistics. The baths never worked in isolation. Latrines sat nearby or inside the complex, usually as a separate room, with a water channel running continuously under a line of stone seats. The famous sponge on a stick, the xylospongium, lived there, dunked in vinegar or salty water between uses. It did not waltz into the coldarium like a community loofah. Parasites and gut bacteria did their dark work and left evidence in the sediments of sewers under Herculaneum, a reminder that even a civilization with this much marble cannot disinfect reality. The separation between bath and latrine counted as a practical call and a health barrier. The ancients were not germ theorists, but they noticed cause and effect, and they liked plumbing that moved things in one direction. The soundscape of the bath meant a lot because it shaped how Romans thought about public life. Voice carried under vaults. Epigrams flew at ear height and landed as reputations. Martial mocks a guy for pocketing someone's bathing towel, and then mocks him again for trying to use it as a toga. Juvenal growls about matricidal emperors, and then clogs the bathhouse drain with his fury. Meanwhile, inscriptions on the wall asked the goddess to handle petty theft or record a donation that paid for a new bench. Social media did not wait for silicon. The peak moment of Roman bath propaganda landed with a smack of grandeur. The baths of Caracalla lined their spaces with rare stones that originally traveled from as far as Egypt and Asia Minor. Giallo Antico from Numidia, Pavonazzetto from Phrygia, granite columns from the Nile Valley. When those baths opened, the eye read international supply lines without needing a map. It felt like the world had been devoured and then plated in cross-section underfoot. The emperor took ownership of water and heat and then handed them out like largesse. Anyone could walk in for a coin. Anyone could crane their neck under the theory of the case. Empires prefer to display rather than explain. The big narrative of decline always tempts, but the baths resist tidy curves. Plenty continued to operate into the 5th century. The aqueducts still ran. The emperors of the Theodosian dynasty did not torch the Tepidaria. What hurt was war. In 537 C, during the Gothic War, the Ostrogothic king Vitiges cut the aqueducts of Rome to crack the city during a siege. That move did more than torment an enemy. It turned off the civic heartbeat of hot water. Without the flow, the baths died slowly. Some buildings morphed into workshops, barns, and eventually a quarry for lime burners. Others shed their marble skins and rose again as churches, monasteries, or palaces, because good concrete never lies down for long. In the East, Byzantine Constantinople kept public baths rolling longer. In the Islamic world, the hammam rose as a cousin to the Roman tradition, with the same love of steam married to the particularities of Islamic modesty and ritual cleanliness. Europe in the early Middle Ages kept local bathhouses active in many towns, although the frequency and flash stumbled. When monastic writers warned against nakedness or lust, the bathhouse slunk into the shadows and popped back up again whenever plague fear retreated and property boomed. The long arc looks less like a cliff and more like a city finding different ways to be warm together. The best archaeology of Roman bathing comes from the moments caught mid-routine by catastrophe. Pompeii's Stabian baths, remodeled in the 1st century baths, and again under Augustus, show separate suites for men and women with a podateria labelled by door frames. Bronze fixtures still glinting under volcanic dust, and main rooms painted in creamy white that throws light around like it was installed by a Scandinavian architect with a soft spot for understatement. The forum baths present a more retail experience, a small city bath that punched above its weight. The suburban bath, out by the city wall, gave us those infamous frescoes and one of the best preserved furnace rooms in the West. Across the Empire and Herculaneum's central baths, layered 2 stories over the ground floor, a rare vertical take that spares scholars guesswork. Move north and try his imperial baths in Germany. Went half-built and then repurposed because historical budgets get cut. The vaulted underground service corridors still snake under the site, a brick labyrinth that reveals a theatre of operations the public was not supposed to see. Rome staged warmth, with a backstage as complex as any opera house. There is charm in the humble too. Small neighbourhood balnear, dotted every region. The Regionary Catalogue's 856 number tells the truth, silkily. Those were often one-furnace establishments, a single apodyterium, a hot room, a warm room, a cold plunge, perhaps a tiny palæstra on the street. The clientele walked over from the next block. The staff knew the regulars. The depolator clocked whose leg hair grew like rye in May. The barber gossiped about a slave girl who thought her master would free her after 10 years and was about to be disappointed. The intimacy attached to a smell of wood smoke and skin. Rome's grandeur sat on a base of routine. Sources preserved the granular. A graffito in Pompeii reads like a sigh about one bather named Secundus stealing a cloak. Another praises the heat of the suburban bath on a rainy day. Lead tokens, stamped with numerals, come from baths and theatres both, a small currency of admission that fits neatly into a palm and into systems of crowd control. If the tokens carry erotic imagery, scholars argue, that says more about Roman humour than explicit function. The city carried a bawdy streak, broad enough to sail a trireme through. The bathing habit touched identity. Smooth skin read as civilized. Body hair removal became part of the male toolkit. A tweezers and a strigil appeared in grave goods, often enough to feel normal. Prodigious body hair could signal barbarism in satire. It could also still look great on a gladiator's poster in the Campus Martius. Contradiction sat happily in the same building. Bathing also signaled Romanization because it required new economics. To run a bathhouse with a reliable hot room, someone needed access to cheap fuel, labor, and water, all scaled beyond a household. That meant markets, municipal organization, property rights, and politics. A provincial town that constructed a public bath signaled to everyone that it had arrived into a certain Roman conversation. Inscriptions across the empire thanked donors for new baths and repairs. Euergetism, the civic generosity of elites in exchange for fame and gratitude, poured out of heated rooms. A well-timed dedication won a man office. A big marble plaque shouted the family name, long after the warm air cooled. The rooms themselves revealed the sophistication of Roman building physics. Architects-oriented hot rooms, to the southwest if possible, catching low afternoon light and extra solar gain. Windows reached toward the sun. Glass panes, rare and expensive, sealed warmth while inviting glow. Vaults redistributed thrust into massive buttresses. Suspensura gave a spring to floors under heat. The spaces breathed with invisible flows that modern thermal modelers can now map. The effect landed on skin, like a soft pressure that the Roman mind found almost moral. Cleanliness linked to purity, warmth linked to civilization. Bathing wrapped ethics in temperature and silk. No one illustrates the duality of opulence and grit like Caracalla's fuel rooms, crawl spaces large enough to drive teams of men through snake under the cold aria. These galleries, service corridors, and storerooms show on the ground plan as a shaded grid at odds with the temple-like symmetry above. Furnace doors, the praefurnia, yawn like avenging monsters. Any narrative that forgets the slaves who kept fires lit and floors glowing leaves a cruel blank in the story. Romans rarely interrogated that blank. Later, readers must. Competing cultures put their own spin on bathing. The Greeks famously wrapped athletics, philosophy, and bathing together in the gymnasium, a word that literally nods to nudity. Rome borrowed the packaging and rebranded it with marble mass and a touch more humility. Jewish communities continued ritual immersion in mikvaot, separate from Roman baths, and keyed to purity laws. Early Christian congregations slowly built baptistries, sometimes adjacent to former baths, arguing their new moral geometry while still trailing a Roman steam cloud from their street clothes. In 1,000 small ways, communities tuned temperature to theology. Artifacts from everyday bath kits carry a domestic tenderness. The araballos, a small glass or ceramic oil flask, often came attached to a strigil in a set. Excavations find them together. Greenish glass, opaque with time. A Roman walking to the bath, with that kit in hand, reads like a figure in a comic strip, alone in a panel that tells a whole day in a few outlines. The kit is the plot twist, the rest is environment. Some emperors threaded their public personas directly through the steam. Hadrian endlessly building, remodeled baths, and visited them across the provinces, from Athens to Antioch. Marcus Aurelius bathed like a philosopher king, modestly scheduling it, and sometimes skipping if duty pressed. Commodus bathed more than he governed, and humiliated the schedule secretaries with his whims in a court where etiquette became law. The bath itinerary functioned like a daily calendar feed. If the emperor skipped the frigidarium, senators got texts in their head. The aesthetic triumphs stacked high. The frigidarium of Caracalla, an enormous hall with 3 massive cross vaults, lifted cold water into the sublime. The tepidaria framed spaces with semi-domes, like open valves. Light entered through clerestory windows that warmed air and turned steam into a painterly medium. Mosaics underfoot told sea stories. The classic swirls of dolphins and tritons that read like a mass market pattern and still feel good on a morning walk. In the smaller baths of Ostia, floors pivot from geometric black and white mosaics to marine fantasies with the confidence of a city that loved daily art enough to install it everywhere. Nothing about the bath asks permission. The bath announces. The numbers sometimes read like mythology until an archaeologist reaches for a tape measure. The main block of Caracalla's central bath building measures roughly 220 by 114 meters set on an axis that shepherds a bather through symmetrical rooms. The entire precinct erects a perimeter, nearly 4 football fields, long on each side. The cisterns tacked on the back hold volumes that modern pools envy, lined with waterproof opus, cinnamon, and connected by an arterial mesh of lead and clay pipes that still turn up with legible stamps. A voracious mosaic fragment of a Nereid riding, a sea creature in Ostia's Baths of Neptune, covers over 1,000 square meters. The whole floor a tidal zone of black tesserae in white foam. The Notitia and Curiosum, late 4th century administrative documents, tote up thermal palaces like they were listing mansions in a registry. Rome, in sum, boiled water on a civic scale and kept score. The last trick of the Roman baths sits in plain sight. They equalize. Wealth can buy a private tub, sure, and plenty of elite houses installed, intimate balnea with clever circulation, like the one at Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli. An Instagram of its day in travertine and water. But the public bath flattened at least one social axis. For an afternoon, a senator and a freedman shared the same ambient temperature. A poet and a bricklayer cursed the same thief. A provincial who had just earned citizenship and kept the toga a little cleaner than necessary stood under the same dome as a man with a lineage older than Cyprus. Critics never getting enough oxygen will say that the toga and the proud always gave away the difference. True, but bodies in heat loosen distinctions. Rome noticed and kept feeding the fires. The finale of any good Roman story arrives with a coin. Emperor coins bragged about aqueducts, fountains, and baths, declaring clementia and liberalitas, with flowing water carved on metal that jangled in the same purses paying the balneator. Collectors today hold those coins and imagine the sound of water coming out of a bronze spout with a faint patina, cold against the wrist. Senators and soldiers walked the same porticos. The emperors named temples after virtues. The baths just provided them. The modern visitor stands in the ruins and gets a contact high off the engineering. Caracalla's outer walls still loom like the chassis of a starship. Diocletian's repurposed Nive baptizes with light. The Stabian baths at Pompeii huddle modestly around their old courtyard, the male section domed and cozy, the female suite compact and elegant with a darling apse. Missing are the towels, the oil, the smell that always stays with the bodies. But the rooms are not silent. Read Seneca and Martial. Read Frontinus and Pliny. Read the Regionary catalogues and the price edicts and the barber shop jokes and the vaults fill again. No fictional characters need apply. The roster is already crowded. Agrippa with his checkbook in 25 by. Frontinus counting quinaria in 97. Caracalla cutting a ribbon in 216C. Diocletian capping prices and then constructing the largest bath block Rome ever saw between 298 and 306. Michelangelo stepping in 1,250 years later and salvaging a dome for the glory of God and the proof of Roman concrete. A nameless Capsarius eyeing a cloak like a man who has watched things vanish too many times to be sentimental. A goddess in Bath, adjudicating stolen sandals on tiny lead sheets with the crisp handwriting of anger. Hair pluckers screaming, sausage sellers singing. A frigidarium, cold as law. A caldarium, hot as gossip. An empire, bathing itself into the story of what it meant to be public. There is one last correction to savor, because it reveals why the Roman bath still casts a spell. The modern mind loves to repackage the ancient world, as filth followed by a miraculous clean awakening, sometime around the invention of antiseptic soap. The Roman case raises that diagram with laughter. Soap as a froth of surfactants was optional. Cleanliness manifested as ritualized sequence, communal infrastructure, and refined engineering habits. The bath was not only about getting dirt off, it was about inhabiting a built environment that turned heat distribution and water flow into civility. The therapy was architecture. Contemporary cities reinvent the bath every few decades under new brands. Health clubs install cold plunges and slap on a membership fee with more digits than a denarius. Boutique saunas market the promise of a reset button with hand-poured wax candles and playlists. The playbook was published in Latin around the time Ovid wrote love manuals, and Augustus collected provinces like they were commemorative spoons. The Romans called the building Firme. Everyone else has spent 2,000 years catching up and then insisting it was their idea. The ruins laugh softly and keep releasing heat at dusk. The catch with viral legends is that they land because they flatter instincts. Bathtubs full of milk flatter the fantasy of luxury as excess. Code bacchanalia flatters the fantasy of moral superiority disguised as interest. Denouncing Roman pipes as mass poison flatters the fantasy of modern expertise humbling the past. The actual truth does something stranger and more satisfying. It shows Romans as pragmatic and theatrical at the same time. They blasted mountains to run water to cities and then poured it into rooms whose purpose was making a crowd feel good in their skin. They monetized that feeling at a coin a head and then turned it into votes, poems, marble, domes, deities, supply lines, and careers, and they left enough behind that anyone who wants to verify can. An afternoon in a Roman bath, imagined accurately enough to fob glasses, includes 100 sensory notes backed by evidence. The sound of a strigil scraping oil, the slosh of a bucket in the furnace corridor, the scent of myrtle oil, the sight of pale sunlight filtering through clerestory panes and catching a fleck of dust, the taste of mineral water flung from a lion's mouth onto a lip too numb to protest. Every piece attaches to an object in a museum case or a line in a dead man's letter. Seneca's complaint opens the door. Frontinus's math charges the pool. Marshall's gripes pick at the seams. The regionary catalogues provide the score. Fikret Yegel and Janet Delane, modern scholars with footprints across these sites, map the traffic with patient, exacting prose. The past returns and shakes its hair out. The only missing piece is the exact temperature of the caldarium on a lucky day in 129 C. The thermometer had not yet been invented. The skin knew. It turned pink and then gold under oil. It stepped out into the evening air and remembered that tomorrow promised the same sequence, and that Rome, for all its cruelties, had mastered the craft of regular joy. The core curriculum of the Roman city taught literacy, law, and bathing. Libraries and law courts got the statues. The baths got the crowds. A coda threads Roman baths to the present in one final loop. In Istanbul, the Kalololu hammam hums under a cascade of domes, steam turning sunlight into honey. In Budapest, the Széchenyi baths pour warm geothermal water into colonnaded pools where chess players remain immovable. In Berlin, a restored Stadtbad brings back a democracy of tiles. In Tokyo, Sento hang on, even as apartments shrink. In New York, a Russian bathhouse carries Soviet ghosts into a city of carbons. None are Roman, strictly, yet every one inherits the same premise. Public heat makes a civic animal more bearable. Infrastructure makes it sustainable. Social friction makes it fun. Nothing about this is new. Back in Rome, the ruins play coy. The baths of Caracalla open to the sky, like a broken amphora filled with weather. Field trips unfold, lunches in the shade of a demolished extra. Runners trace the perimeter, because the old bedrock loves a cadence. The punchline remains carved into the brick, without anyone needing to underline it. The empire is gone. The hot room remembers. The story of Roman bath culture is not about soap or sex or absurd luxury. It is about a people who understood that engineering and leisure can share a wall, and that public life, to be meaningful, ought to involve sweat, noise, and a splash of cold water at the end.